Do not come. The guest list is final. My father's text arrived while I was holding the bent silver wings from my last medical evacuation. Before I could answer, another message appeared. You will embarrass me in front of people who actually matter. My thumb went numb against the screen and the small metal badge trembled in my palm. I replied with one word. Understood. 3 days later, while Malcolm Sutton smiled beneath crystal chandeliers at his military charity, Gala, Dr. Miriam Cole placed a commemorative White House magazine in his hands. He opened it casually, then stopped when he saw my photograph beside the president, my cane, visible, my uniform immaculate, and my damaged flight wings pinned above my heart. His smile vanished so quickly that the photographer lowered his camera. Malcolm leaned toward my stepmother Celeste and whispered, "Why is she with the president?" Miriam heard him. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she touched the sealed federal grant folder beside his plate and said, "Mr. Sutton, before tonight continues, we need to discuss the signature on page 42. I still keep my father's messages, although I no longer read them when I am angry. I keep them because there are women who spend years believing exclusion means they are unworthy. So pour your tea, finish folding the laundry, or settle into your chair and stay with me." To understand that magazine, we need to return 6 months to when I still believed my father's foundation honored my mother. My name is Leah Sutton, and I had served 26 years as an Air Force flight nurse before pain forced me to retire. My final mission ended with a hard landing, a fractured hip, and nearly 2 hours spent holding a bloodline steady for a young airman while fuel leaked beneath us. The silver wings bent during the impact, but the airmen survived. I rarely told that story. I kept the wings in my mother's old sewing box and used a dark wooden cane on the mornings when my left leg refused to cooperate. After retirement, I declined a consulting job in Virginia and built Homefront Bridge from a borrowed office near Walter Reed. We helped military caregivers find emergency housing, medical support, and benefits that had disappeared into paperwork. The work was not glamorous. Some mornings began with cold coffee and ended after midnight. I drove a 12-year-old sedan, rented a small apartment, and knew which families needed grocery cards before they admitted it. By then, Homefront Bridge had quietly helped thousands of households, but my father still described it as Leah's little support room. Malcolm preferred polished stages. He had turned the American Valor Legacy Foundation into a respected name in Washington, with donor dinners, glossy reports, and photographs beside generals. The original idea, however, had belonged to my mother. She believed charity should begin where military families felt most invisible, and I had helped her write the first caregiver program before my second deployment. 6 months before the gala, I found a foundation brochure in a hospital waiting room. The cover showed my old service photograph beneath the words, "A New Sutton Family Initiative." Inside Homefront Bridge was described as a program created by Malcolm and Celeste. My name did not appear once, although my face appeared on 3 pages. I called my father from the parking garage. He sounded irritated before I finished the first sentence. "The family name gives the program credibility," he said. When I asked why no one requested permission to use my image, Celeste took the phone and told me I should be grateful that my military past was still useful to donors. I asked to review the partnership papers and financial reports. Malcolm laughed softly. "You do not hold a position here anymore." I reminded him that my mother had written protective language into the founding charter. Any program built from my service record or my caregiver model required my written approval before transfer or federal funding. For several seconds, the call went quiet, except for the turn signal clicking in my car. Then Malcolm said grief had confused my memory. Celeste added that my mother had signed many documents near the end of her illness. Their certainty disturbed me more than open anger would have. People usually become that calm only after they have prepared their version of the truth. Over the next 2 months, the foundation website changed. My mother's name was reduced to one line beneath Malcolm's portrait, and mine disappeared from the history page. When I asked Evan, my younger half-brother who managed communications, he said Celeste wanted a cleaner story for donors. He sounded ashamed, but he changed nothing. Then Celeste invited me to a promotional photo session. Her assistant asked me to wear civilian clothes, leave my cane outside the frame, and replace my damaged flight wings with a polished set from their costume collection. I declined. My father called that evening and said people donate to strength Leah. They do not donate to damage. I remember standing in my kitchen with one hand on the counter until the ache in my hip passed. The refrigerator hummed behind me, and my mother's ivory fountain pen lay beside a stack of caregiver applications. I wanted to remind Malcolm that the damage he disliked had come from keeping another person alive. Instead, I wrote down his exact words and returned to work. A month later, Evan emailed me an invitation to the foundation's annual gala. The event would celebrate military caregivers and announce a major federal partnership. I accepted because the theme matched the work my mother and I had started. 2 days later, Celeste called and said the invitation had been sent by mistake. I asked whether my seat had been given to someone else. She said the guest list needed people who could reassure donors. Your disagreements with Malcolm make everyone uncomfortable, she explained. I told her I had no intention of discussing family matters at a public event. Her voice softened in the way cruel voices sometimes do before the final cut. Your presence is the family matter. 3 days before the gala, my father sent the text. I did not call him. I did not ask Evan to intervene. Instead, I took the first gala invitation from 20 years earlier and drove to the cemetery where my mother was buried. Her handwriting still crossed the inside flap in blue ink. A charity should never become more polished than the people it was built to serve. I sat in my car until evening, holding that card against the steering wheel. Even now, I cannot remember which song played on the radio, but I remember the cold edge of my mother's fountain pen inside my coat pocket. I cried because my father had not merely removed me from a guest list. He had removed me from a history I helped create. At 9:15 that night, someone knocked on my apartment door. Evan stood outside, carrying a laptop bag and looking as though he had not slept. He asked whether we could talk somewhere private, then placed a small flash drive beside my mother's pen. I think Dad and Celeste used your name on something, he said. The drive contained the foundation's federal grant application. Homefront Bridge was listed as an asset, transferred voluntarily to Malcolm's foundation. The application requested $8 million for national expansion, and nearly $600,000 in scholarship funds had already moved into an event company owned by Celeste. My hands stayed steady until Evan opened page 42. There, beneath a statement claiming I had surrendered all authority over Homefront Bridge, was an electronic copy of my signature. I had never seen the page. I had never approved the transfer. The file also promised that I would appear at the gala and publicly place the program in my father's hands. Evan looked at me across the table. The whole ceremony is built around this. Outside, a delivery truck rattled down the street, and somewhere above us, a neighbor turned off a television. I stared at the false signature and finally understood why Malcolm needed me absent. He was not afraid I would embarrass him. He was afraid I would stand up when they announced my surrender. I kept looking at the false signature until the letters stopped resembling my name. Evan sat across from me with both hands around a glass of water he had not touched. He expected anger, but years in emergency medicine had taught me that panic wastes time. I copied the files, disconnected the drive, and asked him who else had access to the application. Dad, Celeste, the foundation attorney, and me, he said. His voice dropped. I did not know what page 42 said until yesterday. I believed that he had not created the fraud, but belief was not the same as trust. I asked him to forward every original email without changing a subject line, date, or attachment. Then I called Dr. Miriam Cole. Miriam had once chaired a military caregiver conference where I presented Homefront Bridge to fewer than 30 people. She remembered every question she had asked and none of the applause afterward. When I explained what Evan had found, she did not offer sympathy first. She said, "Send me the original file, the charter, and proof that the signature is yours to control." By midnight, she had enough to understand the danger. The grant had not been approved yet, but the foundation planned to present the transfer during the gala as a completed agreement. Cameras, donors, and invited officials would witness what appeared to be my voluntary surrender. Once that story entered public reports correcting, it would become slower and harder. Should I confront him? I asked. Miriam answered without hesitation, "No. Do not interrupt their performance. Make them perform in front of the record." She told me to preserve every message and avoid giving Malcolm or Celeste time to replace documents. Before ending the call, she asked whether I still had my mother's original foundation papers. I found them the next morning in a blue storage box beneath winter blankets. The ivory fountain pen rested inside its cloth sleeve, and beside it lay the charter my mother had signed 21 years earlier. Her handwriting filled the margins with reminders about dignity, transparency, and the danger of turning service into personal prestige. The charter named me as co-creator of the caregiver initiative that later became Homefront Bridge. A separate appendix stated that my military record image testimony and program materials could not be transferred without my written consent. Another clause gave me the authority to request an independent audit if foundation money appeared to benefit a trustee or a trustee's family business. I drove the documents to Miriam's office near Pennsylvania Avenue. She examined the signatures, then compared them with page 42. My real signature leaned slightly upward because of nerve damage in my right wrist. The copied signature remained perfectly level. Miriam marked the difference with a pencil, but warned me that visible suspicion was not enough. A forensic examiner reviewed the files that afternoon. The signature on the grant application had been lifted from an old medical release and placed onto the page electronically. Metadata showed that the document had been created on Celeste's foundation computer, edited twice from Malcolm's account, and uploaded 6 minutes after Evan received instructions to remove me from the Gala list. The email chain was worse. Celeste had written, "Keep Leah out of the room until after the announcement. Once the cameras record it, she cannot undo the story." Malcolm replied less than 4 minutes later, "She will stay quiet. She always does." I read his sentence twice because the confidence behind it hurt more than the insult. That evening, Evan and I met at a small diner near the hospital where Homefront Bridge rented its first office. He ordered apple pie, but only moved the fork through the filling. Finally, he admitted he had spent years laughing when Malcolm dismissed my work, because silence allowed him to remain the favored child. "I kept telling myself I was staying out of it," he said, but I was standing beside him. I did not tell him everything was forgiven. Instead, I thanked him for bringing the files before the gala. He nodded and pushed half the pie toward me, the same way he had shared dessert when he was 10 years old. Over the next 2 days, Miriam assembled a review team. They traced nearly $600,000 from scholarship reserves into Celeste's event company. The invoices listed educational outreach, although the payments covered imported flowers, private transportation designer table settings, and a consulting fee paid directly to Celeste. The grant application also claimed that Homefront Bridge operated under Malcolm's foundation. Payroll records, leases, tax filings, and service agreements proved otherwise. Every caregiver we assisted had entered through an independent program I built after retirement. Malcolm had donated once 6 years earlier, then described that single check as continuing financial sponsorship. The investigators asked whether I wanted the grant withdrawn quietly. I said no. A private correction would protect families from losing federal funds, but it would allow Malcolm to tell donors that a technical problem had delayed approval. The truth needed to be placed before the same people invited to witness the lie. Miriam then told me something Malcolm had never bothered to learn. 3 months earlier, Homefront Bridge had been selected as a national model for military caregiver coordination. The announcement remained confidential until White House Military Family Week. My staff had protected the news because the official publication date fell on the morning of Malcolm's gala. I asked why I had not been told sooner. Miriam smiled. You were told. Your director has been trying to schedule your security briefing for 2 weeks. I remembered 3 messages I had postponed because a caregiver family faced eviction. Even now, I laugh gently at that. My father believed I was hiding from importance, while I was too busy serving people to notice it approaching. The White House ceremony took place the day before the gala. I wore my Air Force service uniform for the first time in years. My hip ached before I reached the security entrance, but I kept the wooden cane with me instead of hiding it. I pinned the bent flight wings above my heart exactly as they had looked after the final evacuation. During the presentation, the president thanked Homefront Bridge for helping more than 4,000 military households secure medical care housing and caregiver support. A photographer captured us beside representatives from the Air Force and military family programs. I did not think about Malcolm until Miriam showed me the commemorative magazine prepared for the following evening. My photograph covered 2 pages. Beneath it, the caption identified me as the founder of Homefront Bridge and a national advocate for military caregivers. The article described the wounded airmen from my final mission, my rehabilitation, and the years spent building a program from a borrowed office. My father had called those years an embarrassment. What happened next is why I kept telling the story, so stay with me a little longer. People do not always erase a woman by ordering her from a room. Sometimes they erase her by placing her signature beneath a story she never agreed to tell and trusting that her silence will complete the forgery. I mailed the canceled gala invitation back to Malcolm with no note. Celeste prepared a speech claiming health complications prevented me from attending and that I had generously transferred Homefront Bridge to the Sutton Foundation. Malcolm sent a final message thanking me for making the mature choice. I did not answer. Evan remained at the gala as communications director. To Malcolm and Celeste, his presence proved that he had returned to their side. In reality, he carried the original flash drive and a certified copy of my mother's charter. Miriam entered as the announced federal guest while I waited in a private room across the hall. Through the monitor, I watched Malcolm welcome donors beneath a banner honoring military caregivers. He said the foundation would soon expand a family program developed under his personal leadership. Celeste stood beside the grant folder, ready to announce my supposed transfer immediately before dinner. Then Miriam approached their table and handed Malcolm the White House magazine. He opened it with the smile he used whenever a camera was near. When he reached my photograph beside the president, his mouth tightened and the color faded from his cheeks. He leaned toward Celeste and whispered, "Why is she with the president?" "Because tonight's program belongs to her," Miriam said. The ballroom doors opened. I walked inside, wearing my service uniform, the bent wings, and the cane they had asked me to hide. Conversation stopped one table at a time. I took the empty seat in the front row and placed my canceled invitation beside the magazine without looking toward my father. Miriam stepped onto the stage before Celeste could begin her announcement. Evan left Malcolm's side and handed the flash drive to the Federal Review Council. Then Miriam rested one hand on the sealed grant folder and asked, "Before this foundation accepts federal recognition, who authenticated Colonel Sutton's signature on page 42. Malcolm's attorney reached for the microphone, but Miriam stopped him with a raised hand. "I did not ask who reviewed the application," she said. "I asked who watched Colonel Sutton sign page 42. My father looked toward Celeste. Celeste looked toward the Foundation Council. Nobody answered. I stood slowly, using the cane they had wanted removed from every photograph. For the record, I said I did not sign that transfer, and I did not authorize anyone to sign for me. Malcolm started to speak, but Miriam asked the technician to place page 42 on the ballroom screen. My copied signature appeared above 200 silent guests. Then the forensic examiner's report appeared beside it. He explained that the image had been lifted from an old medical release, flattened and inserted electronically. The file had been created on Celeste's computer and edited from Malcolm's account. Celeste said her staff handled hundreds of documents and that metadata proved nothing. Evan walked to the stage carrying the original flash drive. "Then the emails may help," he said. His voice shook, but he did not step back when Malcolm told him to sit down. The first email appeared on the screen. Celeste had written, "Keep Leah out of the room until after the announcement." The next line promised that once cameras recorded the transfer, I would not be able to undo the story. Beneath it sat Malcolm's reply, "She will stay quiet. She always does." The chandeliers hummed above us, and somewhere near the kitchen, a glass touched a tray. My father stared at his own words, as though another man had written them. Miriam then asked the Foundation Council whether federal reviewers had been told that I disputed the transfer. He removed his glasses and said they had not. The review team opened the financial section next. Nearly $600,000 intended for military scholarships had moved into Celeste's event company. The ballroom flowers, private cars, designer linens, and consulting fees had been billed as caregiver outreach. Several donors closed their folders before the final invoice appeared. Malcolm called it an accounting misunderstanding. Miriam asked whether he had received my earlier request to inspect the foundation records. Evan displayed the email confirming delivery. My father had forwarded it to Celeste with 4 words. "Do not give her access." This time he did not deny writing them. Then Miriam opened my mother's original charter. The ivory fountain pen lay beside it beneath the document camera. She read the clause naming my mother and me as the creators of the caregiver program. She read the prohibition against using my service record without written consent and the provision allowing an independent audit. For 21 years, that charter had existed in a storage box while Malcolm told donors he had built everything alone. Hearing my mother's name spoken before the room hurt more than I expected. I could not tell you what dress Celeste wore that night, but I remember exactly how cold the metal wings felt against my chest. Miriam finally turned to the White House magazine. She explained that Homefront Bridge had been selected as a national model because it helped more than 4,000 military households secure housing, medical care, and caregiver benefits. The federal recognition belonged to the program, not to Malcolm's foundation. The magazine showed my cane. It showed the bent wings. It described the hard landing and the wounded airmen whose bloodline I held steady until help arrived. The things my father had called damage were now printed as evidence of service. One table stood to applaud, then another, until nearly the entire ballroom rose. I remained seated for several seconds because I did not feel victorious. I thought about my mother writing notes in the charter margins and never seeing her name restored. Recognition did not give me dignity. It only forced other people to notice the dignity they had ignored. Miriam announced that the $8 million grant would not be awarded to the Sutton Foundation. Federal reviewers referred the false signature and financial records for investigation. The foundation board suspended Malcolm and Celeste that evening, froze all discretionary spending, and placed the remaining scholarship money under independent control. By morning, 3 major donors had paused their commitments. Celeste's company received demands for repayment, and the board ordered a complete audit of every family-linked contract. Evan resigned from his communications position and publicly admitted that staying silent had helped the deception continue. The apologies arrived slowly. Board members called. Relatives wrote careful messages about misunderstanding the situation. I answered only the people who accepted responsibility without asking me to protect their comfort. An apology can open a door, but it does not decide how far someone may enter. 4 months later, Malcolm came to the Homefront Bridge office alone. He wore no foundation pin and brought no photographer. He stood near the reception desk while a caregiver completed an emergency housing form, then asked whether we could speak privately. He admitted he had been ashamed of my cane, my scar, and the quiet scale of my work. Those things did not match the polished family story he sold to donors. I thought people would see you as broken, he said. You were not ashamed of my failure, I answered. You were ashamed that my sacrifice did not match your decorations. He lowered his head and did not argue. For the first time in years, my father listened without preparing a response. I told him forgiveness would not restore his authority. He had to credit my mother and me in writing cooperate fully with the audit and stop using my name to repair his reputation. Any relationship between us would be built privately through consistent actions, not public speeches. Malcolm agreed. He began coming once a month to stack chairs, carry supply boxes, and serve coffee. He left before cameras arrived. I did not call that redemption, but it was the first honest work I had ever seen him do without asking who was watching. 18 months later, Homefront Bridge opened a new center near Walter Reed, bearing my mother's name. We framed the White House magazine in the hallway, but not on the page, showing me beside the president. I chose the page, showing an older military spouse receiving help with housing papers. Evan joined our communications team at an ordinary salary. He no longer introduced himself as Malcolm Sutton's son. My father still came quietly. Some mornings we spoke. Other mornings we worked in the same room without forcing closeness before it was ready. I kept the bent wings on my uniform and my mother's pen in my desk. The canceled gala invitations stayed in a drawer beneath them. It reminded me that another person's guest list can exclude your body from a room, but it cannot erase the work your life has already placed in the world. The people who remove your name often depend on your silence to finish the job. A scar does not shame a family. A family is shamed when it asks the wounded person to hide. And recognition does not create your worth. It reveals who failed to see it. If your own family has ever minimized your sacrifice or treated your achievements like an inconvenience, tell me one thing you wish they had understood. Your words may help someone else feel less alone. I would be honored if you shared the story with a person who needs to remember that exclusion is not the end of purpose. And join me again for another story of courage and healing. Wherever you are listening tonight, I hope you rest, knowing your name still belongs to you.